Well, in 1917, Bruce was the president of the Phoenix Society, a literary group. In addition to that, a passionate believer that history was enormously important for the liberations of one's mind and so on and so forth. And that before bodies could be liberated, that minds had to be liberated. Okay? He said the following at the Yonkers Church, Baptist Church. I believe it was the Messiah Church, Messiah Baptist Church in Yonkers, New York, in 1917. There is one other thing I wish to say, gentlemen, before I bid you welcome, and is that you will endeavor individually and collectively to popularize the movement now taking form and favoring the establishment in all of our Negro institutions of learning of a chair of Negro history, so that generations come after us will know more about our race from reading and study than most of us know now. Because the textbooks written by white men have been and are woefully silent on the Negro's contribution to the general knowledge of the world, our environment makes us think white. And some of us think white so persistently that we haven't time to think black. But to this complexion, we must ultimately come. And I urge upon you, gentlemen, to help with voice and pen to hasten the coming of the morning when Negroes all over this broad land will wake up to the importance of thinking black. Now that's 1917. You know, it's a minor, I think, change in language. That could be 2003 without any problem particularly at all. Well, as I said before, Bruce and these colleagues of his were absolutely marvelous men. They were men. Bruce had no more than third grade education. But by the turn of the century, according to the historian I. Garland Penn of the African American Press and the contemporary Bruce, he was probably the widest read journalist in black communities in the United States. He, in addition to that, was a person who came under the impact of at least 5 great Pan-African thinkers during his life. As a young child, Martin Delany and Henry Garnett were his close associates and mentors. By the turn of the century, he had met J. Robert Love, Alexander Crummell, and of course someone who was completely overlooked in all this discussion, and I think the origin of a lot of all this, is Edward Wilmot Blyden. All of you at some point in time, I think, should go back and read the 1887 book by Blyden called Christianity, Islam, and Negro Race. And in there's a very interesting section on his belief and definition of education. More important, in 1884, Blyden came to Hampton, my alma mater, now called Hampton University, then called Hampton Institute. And after his speech, he stepped out and said, "Who amongst these graduates will return with me to Africa to help build this great center of Negro nationality?" And you know, out of those graduates came 8 people, got up out of their chairs, took off their robes, their hats, stepped up on the stage, and within 3 days, left with him to go back to Liberia. Isn't that great? Can you imagine something like that happening right now? Now, you know, I was talking with a young man who's running Hampton, and I said, you know, can you find any of the letters and notes? Who were these people? You know, it's absolutely fascinating. All I'm saying here is one thing that's consistent here, is that one of my motivations sometimes in getting a PhD was somewhat to denounce the process, because it is so easy to become the degree and see the degree and the acquiring of credentials as a means of distancing yourself from people real people, who threw rocks and arrows and opened up doors just so you could walk through. Because when I was a young boy, the people that I'd spent a lot of time with was a group of winos. My people on the grocery store, a drugstore called the Metropolitan Drug. Behind that was a great community of winos, all men. They had been broken one time. They were great men one of those days. And they weren't predatory people at all, like we see now people with addiction. And they had just had some problems, and they had turned to the refuge of wine. But the thing was, when I was 10 and 9 and 8, one of the great things we used to do with these guys on Saturday afternoons was play softball. And after we played softball, these guys sat down and told us some absolutely fabulous stories about my community. Now, I didn't really know that you could make money off this type of stuff or make a living or anything, you know, because I hadn't come from that type of background. But I did know that these men excited my imagination. And all I'm saying is here is that education should not be something that is about the social achievement and distancing yourself from average people. But it should be something that you use the critical skills that you have to deal with the problems that people face, particularly those in your particular group. Now, Bruce and his colleagues were really the people who really championed the study of African American history. Long before this cadre, a small cadre of university trained colleagues came along. And there's a host of these people who I talk about in this area, both men and both women. And the interesting thing here, they are all across the board in terms of their ideological perspective. They are all not nationalists. You know, some have a class and a race perspective, some are somewhat neutral in their own particular policy of politics and outlook on the world. But the thing is that they were passionately involved with the preservation of history. And this cadre of people included not only Bruce, but it included Arthur Alfonso Schoenberg, one of the great collectors of Africana material. It included Laura Eliza Wilkes. It included Joel Augustus Rogers, Hubert Henry Harrison, Drusilla Dungy Hewson, for example. Grace B. Campbell was another great orator, for example. And you know, we don't have anything that looks at these people as a body of intellectual thought. And what my work really tries to do is step outside of the academy and really argue that critical thinking is not for simply the privileged in society. That everybody should think critically. Do you know I've had young black men in discussions like this tell me, and this is a mind-blowing statement, that education is for white folks. Can you believe what that is? Now I understand some of what that feeling is, visceral feeling against an institution. But critical thinking should be everybody's privilege. As a matter of fact, if you can't think critically, you're really down the drain. And it does not mean that you have to have, per se, a formal education. And so rarely do we turn outside the academy to see what was that intellectual body of thought about. And that's largely what this attempt to do is. And it's a really exciting and enjoyable effort. As a matter of fact, on the other side of that, not only were people who were thinkers, and all of these people published books, they published pamphlets, they put together work. You know, one of the most popular pamphlets in Harlem at one time was a little book, I can't call this a book, a pamphlet, by J. Rogers called The Five Negro Presidents. And Rogers argued that if you use, yes, this is The Five Negro Presidents by Joel Augustus Rogers. And he argued really if you use the racial criteria, for example, the state of Virginia, that Warren G. Harding, for example, would have to be classed as a Negro. Period. Because this is Warren G. Harding's great uncle right here. Now the only reason that and the only reason that Rogers got into this is because Rogers came from a dual family. They were both light-skinned, but one was lighter than the other. And John Clark told me a long time ago, he came to Philadelphia in 1918 to see his sister, and his sister, who was passing for white, denied that she knew Rogers. And it hurt him so bitterly that Rogers really committed himself to proving that race was a political construct, that anything that had to do with a biological perspective at all. Okay? And so Rogers spent a lot of time doing it, but he had a personal mission involved in this. Well, in addition to this, along with this group of people who champion history, published books and articles, and as I said before, the great collection of papers, not only of John Edward Bruce, but also Jeffrey Perry has put out this great reader on Hubert Harrison, of which he had papers locked up allegedly for a long time, but it is now out by Western University Press. You had also a group of people, as I said before, who were these great orators, who were also driven by history. As a matter of fact, somewhat of my kind of intellectual, theoretical template for all of this really comes from the Italian theorist that I'm sure you all are familiar with, and that is Mr. Antonio Gramsci. And Gramsci was largely a person who believed that there was something called an organic intellectual. And maybe I could share with you very quickly Gramsci's definition of an organic intellectual, because I largely thought that it fits quite well for what I'm doing. He said the following: organic intellectuals are produced by social conflict. They direct the ideas and aspirations of their class, even though they hold no formal status or employment as intellectuals. They learn about the world by trying to change it, and they change the world by learning it from the perspective of the needs and aspirations of their social group. Now, he wasn't talking about black folk per se when he said this, so this is not exclusively at all a black phenomenon. As a matter of fact, one of the most enjoyable things talking to a very prominent white female professor when I first embarked upon the study. And she told me, this is very interesting. My father, who grew up in Long Beach, California, was a mailman. And he was a member of an Irish Catholic literary club called the Spit and Argue Club. And the Spit and Argue Club met every Saturday morning down by the docks to deal with local issues, regional issues, international issues. And I said, well, damn, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Now, I didn't spend a lot of time with this. So this is not exclusively a race-based interpretation per se, because you can turn to a lot of people and look at this. But I am saying here that there's some enormously creative minds, simply because they have not been legitimized through the process of a PhD, who we need to take a look at. Okay. Now, on the flip side of this other group of people are these wonderful, wonderful orators, these absolutely great orators. Riding in here, I was listening, is it station 94.1? Is that it? Does anybody know the big station out in Bakersfield? Anybody from Bakersfield in here? No Bakersfield people come over here and listen to that? Oh my God. Anyway, whatever the big station was in here. I came in and I was listening to 50 Cent. And how many people know 50 Cent out here? Well, the young people know 50 Cent. I know the old people don't know 50 Cent. Yeah, well, maybe one or two old people know 50 Cent. Well, there's a chapter in this, not in the Bruce book, but in the anthology. There's a wonderful little section that's going to be entitled High Stepping on Hot Cement: The Politics and Contribution of Street Oratory, and particularly its relationship to the kind of legitimizing and popularizing of history. And I know you're wondering, how do we help this connect to 50 Cent? I'll get to it in just a second. I'm on a sabbatical right now. It's a very wonderful time in my life, and I guess I begin to use Du Bois as my model. A lot of, there's some people out here who retire at 50. And here's Du Bois, who writes one of the most important books ever, not only in his career, but across the board, at 66. That shows you that there certainly is intellectual life after 50. Wouldn't you? Amen. Front row agree with me? I'm not including you. I'm talking about these old heads over here. No, so and the other thing is, I was asking Bill on the way here, I can't remember the guy. Who's the guy who was on the way to Damascus? Yes, and he was struck down, the light hit him. Well, that's just the way I feel. I was struck, and I've been working. I've been working just like a Trojan for the last, I guess month. Night and day, just writing and cranking. I got about 5 or 6 different projects with Duke and Notre Dame, and 2 at NYU, and I got this edited thing I'm doing. I mean, just like it just pouring out. So I've been listening to music, and I think writing and music go together. So on the one hand, I'm listening to, and I brought my music along because I wrote while I was here. I just didn't come to sleep. These guys went to sleep. They know I'm not lying. But on the one hand, you have Miles Davis, who I've been just love and been listening to. And it's kind of hip to say Miles Davis, but Miles had his own problems. But I'll get to it in just a second now. And if you ever listen to love songs, it's a wonderful, wonderful piece. Okay. On the flip side, the other person I've been listening to and enjoying too is Mr. Lowdown himself, Mr. 12 Play, Mr. R.L. Kelly. R.K. Yeah, I know you guys. Now, again, now that's not too young right there. Now, I wonder, how you connect these two things together with 50 Cent, R. Kelly, and Miles Davis. Well, as I was driving in, I thought of a couple things. One, youth culture is almost always denounced by older generations. Toni Morrison told me that right directly. No matter what happens, we tend to be horrified by what younger people do and say. And just like the black speech movement on black college campuses in the 1920s and in the 1960s. I spent a week in Hamptons. Oh, isn't this incredible? I spent a week in Hamptons administration building in 1969. I'm telling you now how old I am. A week in Hamptons administration in 1969 just to have a Negro history course. Isn't that incredible? Now, things have changed quite, but there's some other things about too. My mother stayed 39 until I became 37. And never, I'm going to tell you, young people never grow old. Now, that's not to say chronologically don't grow old, but don't use the vitality of your youthful minds, because at one level, Du Bois is a good example how age is really much more, and productivity is much more a projection of spirit and in the internal sense, So never be befuddled by these young folk and what they're doing, because this is a repetitive process. I saw a lot of people in 1969 drug out by their parents over black power. Things really depend upon chronologically how you experience them. But anyway, as I was saying about 50 and Miles and this music I've been listening to. And the reason why I talked about R. Kelly, long before Kelly became a popular musician, he's kind of bunkered in now in Homewood, outside of Chicago. And he's got some current problems. He's still productive in writing and this type of stuff. But he was a street entertainer in Chicago. And I first saw this brother while I was teaching at Governor State University, long time ago. Nobody knew him, but he is a great street entertainer. Well, a lot of this is connected to probably one of the greatest and overlooked street orators. And there were two of them. The first of them was Hubert Henry Harrison. And Harrison was a gifted intellectual. He wrote, and he actually pioneered book reading, book reviews. Go look at Jeffrey Perry's anthology. My time is limited, and I know I don't want to run too late on it. But look at Jeffrey Perry's anthology, 2001, the Hubert Harrison reader. Really the only person who straddled both the people who function like historians but did not have degrees, but also people who were great orators. But the second is a guy who is really in the tradition of this kind of young rap culture, and that is Sufi Abdul Ahmed. Sufi Abdul Ahmed. Well, if you want to read a little about him, you can do two forms. You can go to the original sources. The original sources of the WPA papers, edited by Roy Otley, and eventually published in 1940-41. And there's a great little pieces in there written. There's some written by Claude McKay and others. Or you could go to the article I wrote in 1991 in Afro-Americans in New York Life and History. But Sufi Abdul Ahmed, he appeared on street corners. And all of this is all laid out to the New York Age throughout 1934 to 1937. And he came to New York from a campaign in 1928 south side of Chicago. He appeared with high boots, a red cummerbund, red cape, turban. He had a cadre of instruments around him. He had some people he called jiggers who danced to the music rhythmically. You only see this in Memphis now. He had almost an entourage. And Sufi, even in this apparatus was deadly serious. And he was very, very effective in opening up and desegregating white collar positions in Harlem, New York, where you had at least 95 to 96% of people who were buying, for example, at Bloomstein's. And they refused to hire anybody beyond people who ran the elevators and dusted the floors. Just simply would not do it at all, period. Now, there are other people involved in this whole thing, but Sufi was an absolute genius when it came to this. The other side of that, in terms of activist politics, he also had one foot in the kind of spiritual world. He and his third wife, he had three, his third wife was Madame Fufu Tan. Madame Fufu Tan was a black Chinese soothsayer and also dream interpreter. And one of the wonderful things about independent entrepreneurs of black women, they did a lot of things during the 1920s and 30s that we've completely forgotten. What they had letter writing shops. And they wrote letters back home for people. And Madame Fufu Tan interpreted dreams for people. And Madame Fufu Tan and Sufi were also jointly the co-founders and the leaders of the Holy Temple of Tranquility. Now, Sufi, you would think Sufi was a Muslim, and there was a Sufi movement in the 1920s, but I'm not quite sure. He was more of a Pentecostal in one sense. But with all of this, he was, on the flip side, a great street orator and had a passionate commitment to history. So bundling these two communities together, I try to stake out with this whole notion of a kind of organic intellectual approach like Gramsci, their methodical contribution. And I mean, this is not touch and feel history at all. This is all based upon hard, very hard, pragmatic, detailed primary sources. And so this is not, believe me because I'm saying it. All the primary sources there, and I published a lot about this. But in addition to the Bruce book, which I think should be out by the fall, tell the people that you also want to see this anthology as quickly as possible, because we're working real hard. I got a good group of people on this, and it's going to be a lot of fun doing. And we're into it right now. Our deadline is August for the journal, and from there we're going to try to turn it over to some press, but NYU has a proposal right now. And Jennifer Hammer, again, is my editor's name. She told me if I would have known you were coming, she would have brought some flyers and that type of thing, but it's too late. And the check that they were supposed to send me just got there the day I left to come here. So that's the short story. Now, continuing here with this talk, I want to talk a little bit about their relationship to this world of university-trained scholars. And I'll go through it as quickly as possible, but I do want to spend some time with Huggins. Now, Du Bois was an interesting guy. Oh, terribly. I mean, Du Bois had probably one of the most, well, maybe not the most, but he had a pretty damn big ego. A huge ego. And I know he had a confrontation once with Richard B. Moore that was hilarious. Richard B. Moore had the audacity. Moore was another one of these guys, these self-trained guys, from the Caribbean, from Barbados. And he established the Frederick Douglass Bookstore in 1945. He was the spokesman for the Communist Party and the Scottsboro Boys. And also knew of Bruce, because of Bruce's importance not only to the Garvey movement, but as a senior scholar in this particular group. But he had the audacity to ask Du Bois a question when he came to give his lecture. And Du Bois turned at him and his group, told him, well, I thought you came here to learn something. And he promptly walked out on him. Well, one of the things that's interesting about this group, particularly Schoenberg, is they had a great collection. And Du Bois was one of Schoenberg's editors. When Bruce died in 1924, he left his entire library to Schoenberg. And Schoenberg often came to, particularly to Du Bois, to have him edit some of his material, because Schoenberg was originally a Spanish speaker from Puerto Rico. But in this process, Du Bois would borrow primary materials from him. And a lot of times he would not acknowledge in his publications where it came from. Eventually, Bruce and Du Bois and Schoenberg had a little falling out, and they charged him with plagiarism. And the charge really was that he had plagiarized his version of the Pan-African movement and taken it all of it from Deuce Muhammad Ali. And that Deuce Muhammad Ali, who was a dynamic figure at the turn of the century who edited the African Times and Orient Review. Well, along with that, one of the most unfortunate things about their relationship is when Schoenberg showed his library to the New York public system, Du Bois was the one person who opposed his appointment as the curator of his own collection because he did not have a degree. A little bit on this really hurt Schoenberg quite a bit. But he was also a very close friend with Charles S. Johnson, a great sociologist. Johnson brought him down to Fitz for a couple of years and eventually came back and finished his life as the curator of his own collection. Alain Locke, very interesting guy, has both a closet private life that is unspeakable publicly, but a public life that is enormously important. Absolutely. Alain Locke is interesting because Bruce and Schoenberg were very close to Locke. As a matter of fact, in 1911, this group talked about, particularly Bruce and Schoenberg and David Bryan Fulton as a part of this group, established something called the Negro Society for Historical Research. That's about 4 years before the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History was organized by Whitson. And they went to President Durkee at Howard University and really argued that their representative should be Professor Alain Locke. And they helped raise the money for him to leave in 1922 to go to the formal opening of the tomb of King Tutankhamun. This is the type of stuff they were about. They also shared primary materials with him. Alain Locke was also an editor of the materials. And it was a fairly cordial relationship. Locke was also a corresponding member of the Negro Society for Historical Research and gave the first public lecture for that particular group. Now, lastly is Whitson, and then we'll go to particularly say a little bit about Huggins. Whitson is another guy, interesting guy. Absolutely cantankerous, hard to deal with, difficult, domineering, passionately committed to his work. Whitson and Du Bois, huge egos. Locke also. Whitson left largely academia because he felt that the curriculum could not be changed. He left as a dean at Howard University, and he was very uncomfortable about what was happening. He puts all this together in a book that some of you have heard about, and that is The Miseducation of the Negro. Somewhat polemical, of course, but all of that was published and serialized in the Negro World garbage paper in the 1930s. But one of the things that the famous quote Whitson said in here is the following: if you can control a man's thinking, you have to worry about his action. When you determine what a man shall think, you're going to have to concern yourself with what he will do. If you make a man feel that he is inferior, you do not have to compel him to accept an inferior status, for he will seek it himself. If you can make a man think that he is justly an outcast, you do not have to order him to the back door. He will go without being told. And if there is no back door, his very nature will demand one. In other words, again, he really felt the whole notion that history creates an identity. And he was very much involved in that particular struggle. They had a reasonably cordial relationship. The fallout between Bruce and Whitson was he would not publish the work of Laura Eliza Wilkes. And Bruce appealed to Whitson to publish the work by him, but he just simply wouldn't. Wilkes, unfortunately, died in 1922 before this all was shifted out. But they had a much more, I think, cordial relationship and closer relationship. And he wrote a very interesting review of the Garvey movement. And the reason why many of these self-trained people went to the Garvey movement, even though they had some ideological differences with Garvey, because Bruce was Garvey's private secretary for 6 years, is that the Garvey movement provided an institutional base and also provided an outlet for them to publish their ideas. The Negro World and the Daily Negro Times had a circulation of over 50,000 people per week, and that's an enormous circulation. Well, lastly, let me make some comments about Willis Nathaniel Huggins. I could not find any references at all anywhere on Willis Nathaniel Huggins, which I think is just utterly and totally outrageous. The best primary material came out of this folder here, which is the Schoenberg copies of some stuff I pulled out of the Schoenberg vertical file at the Schoenberg Center in New York City. And let me say the following. Huggins, of this group of people I mentioned, probably is the most interesting because he had an intimate and close relationship with community scholars. He was a mentor to them, and a very important mentor, always mentioned by people, irregardless if they are the left or the right or whatever their politics, particularly endeared by John G. Jackson and endeared by John Henry Clark and others. Well, Nathaniel Wilson and Nathaniel Huggins, who lived from 1886 to 1941, he was born in Selma, Alabama, 1886. His father was a Baptist minister, and eventually they moved to Washington, D.C. He gets a bachelor's degree from Columbia and becomes a teacher by 1914. And interesting enough, he develops a close friendship with a man by the name of Channing Tobias. And Channing Tobias was the head of the colored YMCA movement. And Channing Tobias was also the uncle of John G. Jackson, another one of these self-trained people. And ultimately, there's a connection that brings him back to this, to Jackson and others. Well, he teaches from 1917 to 1922 in Chicago, and he publishes in a variety of newspapers. Eventually, he travels around and goes to New York. And in New York, he is involved with both J. Rogers, Arthur Schoenberg, in trying to change the curriculum of the New York public school system and add African history. He's opposed. But they set up a liberation school at the 135th Street YMCA and teach classes to the students for free. Well, eventually, Huggins does the following things. He becomes an entrepreneur. He establishes the Blyden Bookstore. He establishes the Blyden Literary and History Society. In that comes the young students, John Henry Clark, John G. Jackson, and others. They publish material. As a matter of fact, they put 2 books out. In 1934, Jackson and Huggins published together a Guide to Study of African History. And in 1937, they published an Introduction to African Civilization with main currents in Ethiopian history. He was also an activist. He was very much involved in the support of the struggle in Ethiopia against the Italian invasion. My time is limited. I don't want to run too late on here.